Alex stared at the classroom clock, each tick bringing her closer to the inevitable. Her shoulders ached from hours of holding them tight, braced against what waited after the final bell. The dried chocolate milk stain on her math homework caught her eye, a brown constellation of cruelty from this morning's accident. She could still hear their laughter, still feel the cold liquid seeping into her favorite sweater, the one Mom had saved 3 paychecks to buy for her 12th birthday. It was an accident, they'd said, all mock innocence when Mrs. Peterson looked their way. But Alex had seen the glint in Scott's eyes, caught the silent high five between Jenny and Kate when they thought no one was watching. Always careful, always just enough plausible deniability. That's what made Scott so dangerous. He knew exactly how far to push things, how to hurt without leaving evidence. The incident this morning had been calculated, like everything Scott did. He'd waited until she'd finished all her homework, made sure the milk carton was almost empty so it wouldn't make too much noise when it fell. "Oops," he'd said, green eyes wide with fake concern. "Guess you'll have to redo it all." Jenny and Kate had giggled right on cue, their perfectly synchronized cruelty a reminder that Alex was always, always on the outside. Her stomach churned as she glanced at the window. The autumn sun painted long shadows across the playground, and beyond that, the trail. Everyone knew about it. Parents warned their kids to stay away. Teachers had given stern lectures about town boundaries and private property. There were stories about it, whispered during sleepovers and traded like currency at lunch tables. Stories about kids who went in and came out different, or didn't come out at all. Last week, during one of his lectures about staying away from the trail, Mr. Jenkins had mentioned that it used to be part of an old logging road, back when the town was first built. But that was before the accidents, he'd said, then quickly changed the subject. Alex had done some research in the school library, found old newspaper clippings about disappearances. 3 kids in 1987, a teenager in 1995, 2 hikers in 2002, all eventually found, but none of them quite right afterward. They told stories that couldn't be true, about paths that went nowhere and shadows that moved wrong. Alex had always been the careful one, the good girl who followed rules, who tried to fade into backgrounds and slip through days unnoticed. But 4 months of torment had worn her down, carved hollow spaces inside her where certainty used to live. She thought about telling Mom again, imagined the worry lines deepening around her eyes. Mom had enough to handle since Dad left, working double shifts at the diner and pretending everything was fine. The last thing she needed was more proof that her daughter couldn't handle her own problems. The final bell shattered her thoughts. Around her, chairs scraped and backpacks zipped, the classroom dissolving into the chaos of freedom. But Alex's movements were mechanical, each book placed in her bag with deliberate slowness. She'd learned that being last out gave them less time to torment her before their parents arrived. Sometimes Scott's mom was early, and on those days she could almost make it home without incident. Through the window, she could see them already claiming their usual spot by the bike racks. Scott's red jacket like a warning flag, the same shade as the anger that flashed in his eyes whenever teachers turned away. Jenny braiding Kate's hair, both of them scanning the exits like predators. They were patient. They would wait. But behind them, the trail entrance beckoned, a gap between ancient oaks, shadow dark even in daylight, forbidden, dangerous, safe? Alex's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood, her decision crystallizing like frost. Sometimes the monster you knew was worse than the one you didn't. Besides, what was one more school rule broken? They'd already accused her of cheating last week, had somehow convinced Mrs. Peterson that Alex had copied Kate's quiz. It didn't matter that Alex had never cheated in her life. Scott's lies were always more believable than her truth. She slipped out the side door, keeping close to the building's shadow. 20 feet to the trail entrance, 15, 10. She heard Jenny's laugh, high and sharp like breaking glass, but didn't look back. 5 feet. The gap between the trees looked smaller up close, barely wide enough for her backpack. The branches seemed to lean toward each other, like hands about to clasp. Alex ducked into the trail. The temperature dropped immediately, like stepping into a cave. Fallen leaves crunched under her feet, the sound too loud in the sudden quiet. She walked quickly, not running. Running would make noise, would draw attention. The trail curved gently left, and the school disappeared behind a wall of trees. The woods seemed to swallow all sound from the outside world, replacing it with a silence that pressed against her ears. She checked her phone. 3:45. If she hurried, she could be home before Mom started wondering. The trail wasn't that long. She'd seen it from the bus window, knew it cut through to Maple Street in less than 5 minutes. A shortcut, really. Almost sensible if you ignored all the stories. But something was wrong. The trail should have ended by now. The trees were different here, older somehow, their bark dark and gnarled in patterns she'd never seen before. She checked her phone again. 3:50. The sun seemed lower than it should be, the shadows between trees stretching like hungry fingers. Had she somehow missed the turn? But there hadn't been any other paths, just this one winding deeper into the woods. The air felt thick, like breathing water, and each step seemed to take more effort than the last. A cold spot brushed her arm, raising goosebumps. The air felt different, heavier, like the moment before a storm, but without clouds. She turned to retrace her steps, but the path behind her looked nothing like what she remembered. The trees were wrong, their branches reaching at impossible angles, creating shapes that hurt her eyes if she looked too long. Her chest tightened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting the urge to run. Running was what prey did. She wasn't prey. She just needed to think. Think like the good student she was supposed to be, the one who always had answers in class until Scott started his whisper campaign about her being a teacher's pet. The trail curved right, then right again, and again, and again. She should be walking in a circle, should be seeing her own footprints, but the path kept going. Impossibly going. The laws of geometry seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving something else in charge, something that didn't care about the way things were supposed to work. The shadows were definitely wrong now. They moved against the light, bending in ways shadows shouldn't. And it was getting darker, faster than sunset should allow. Her phone showed 4, but the forest was draped in twilight. The screen's glow seemed to attract the darkness, making it pool and swirl around her hands like curious smoke. Something moved in her peripheral vision. A darkness deeper than shadow, gone when she turned her head. The cold spot was back, trailing her like a curious animal. The air pressure changed, squeezing her ears like she was underwater. Each breath felt like drinking ice. "You're being stupid," she whispered, and her voice sounded flat. "Wrong. It's just a trail." But it wasn't. She knew that now, deep in her bones where truth lives. The trail was something else, something that had been waiting. Not for her specifically, maybe, but for someone scared enough to stumble into its mouth. She thought about those newspaper articles, about the people who'd come out changed. Had they felt this too? This sense of being watched by something that had never known human eyes? Like the shadows in the school hallway where they cornered her. Like the bathroom stall where she hid during lunch. She'd been giving her fear away in pieces, feeding it to places that hungered for such things. First to Scott and his friends, now to this place that seemed to breathe around her. The darkness was closer now, patient as a spider. The cold spots multiplied, boxing her in. She could feel the trail's attention, curious about this new frightened thing in its domain. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a tunnel that grew narrower with each step. The path ahead split and rejoined itself, like a river braiding around invisible obstacles. Then she saw it, a flash of red in the distance. Scott's jacket? Impossible. But there it was again, just at the edge of vision, the same red he'd worn while dumping milk on her homework, while convincing teachers of her imagined crimes. Her heart skipped, then raced. Had he followed her? Was this all some elaborate trap? But when she blinked, the red was gone. Instead, there was only more trail, more trees that couldn't exist, more shadows that moved like liquid. The cold intensified, and she realized something terrible. The trail was in her head now, reading her fears like a book, learning what made her pulse quicken and her breath catch. Alex stopped walking. Fear had driven her here, but fear would kill her if she let it. She'd spent so long being afraid, making herself small, giving her power away. To bullies, to shadows, to trails that shouldn't exist. She thought about her mother, working double shifts with tired eyes but never complaining. About her father, who'd run away from his problems and left them to clean up the mess. About Scott, who was probably just as scared as she was deep down, but chose to make others afraid instead of facing it. No, she said, and her voice was stronger. No more. The pressure increased until her ears popped. The shadows writhed like living things, reaching for her with fingers of pure darkness. But Alex stood her ground, heart hammering but feet planted firm. She thought of all the times she'd stayed quiet, all the times she'd looked away, all the power she'd given to her fear. "I'm not prey," she said to the darkness. "I'm not your food. I'm walking home now, and you're letting me go." Something shifted in the air, like a held breath released. The shadows retreated just slightly, curling back like scorched paper. The path ahead changed, straightened. Through the trees, she could see Maple Street's familiar glow, warm and impossible and real. Alex walked forward, shoulders back, eyes ahead. The cold spots faded, the shadows returned to their proper shapes, though she could still feel them watching, still sense their hunger. By the time she reached the street, the trail behind her looked almost normal. Almost. She checked her phone one last time. 4:15. Mom wouldn't even be worried yet. The next day, Scott wore his red jacket like a warning flag. Jenny and Kate flanked him at the bike rack, their usual morning ritual of watching who looked afraid. But when he saw Alex, something in her eyes made him step back. Just slightly. Just enough. Later, she heard whispers that Scott had tried to spread a new rumor about her, but no one seemed interested anymore. Fear was contagious, but so was its absence. Even Jenny and Kate started making eye contact in the hallway, nervous little glances that held something like respect. Alex walked past them, head high. She'd stared down hungry shadows. Human monsters didn't frighten her anymore. Sometimes at night, she still dreamed of the trail, of paths that bent wrong and darkness that thought. But those dreams didn't wake her anymore. Behind the school, the trail waited in afternoon sunlight. Patient, hungry, but not for her. Never again for her. She'd learned its secret, after all, the same secret that made bullies back down and shadows retreat. Fear only works if you feed it.